Poems later tonight. I'm going to read a series of poems that are connected by the fact that I have never read them in public. And that's mostly because they're newish, but in some cases not. It's just because it wasn't the right thing to read. But I do want to start with to share a found poem, and this came out of my work with Planned Parenthood. I work for them in their used book sale, and I get to curate all the poetry books, which is really wonderful. And this, you probably can't really see it because it's sort of dark, but this beautiful little postcard, handmade, hand-painted letterpress appeared in a used poetry book. And it has this wonderful two-line poem on it that I wanted to share with you by an author named Sean Bernard, who I have never heard of, and I regret to say I did not look up, but here's the poem. My wife strokes my hand, my shooting hand, my trigger finger, and I yawn. I want to begin with a poem that I want to read for all of you, but especially for Peg Quinn. A couple of months ago, Peg read in Santa Barbara with another poet named Teddy Macker, who I think is going to read here in June. And if you've never heard Teddy read, you must attend that reading. But she read a poem that I think was titled, I Want to Be Teddy Macker's Daughter. If Teddy Macker were my father, which she, they're both right? But she had observed Teddy and he has two girls, at one of Teddy's reading and went home and wrote this poem. And when she read it, I remembered, I too have written a poem about Teddy Macker and his daughters while having gone to a Teddy Macker reading and observing his daughters. So here's my version. The Poet's Daughter. My father wrote poems about me, would point me out when I was in the audience, say he knew he was embarrassing me, then would read the poems anyway. The ladies at the readings smiled. I felt the white shine of their teeth at my back as I hunched, dug for a pen in Mama's leather sack. Mama stood at the side or in the back, baby sister wrapped to her chest. She jostled and swayed, mouth a hard horizontal. I was 5 or 6 or 7, had my own notebook, wrote while Daddy read, found my way out of those rooms, those rows of metal chairs. We were walking, Daddy and I, his big hand around mine. It was nearly dark, nearly home, close enough to see the light flick on in our kitchen, to see Mama through the window. He was in a hurry, and I said, "Don't rush, Daddy, don't rush." He stood for an instant between going and slowing. I climbed on a rock, pretended to tumble off. We laughed, then sat, made believe we were eating a snack. I was 5 or 6 or 7. That's how we wrote poetry. The next few poems I'm going to read are mother poems because they just don't seem to stop asking to be written. Jittery. Mother sheep sometimes get jittery, their lambs fallen from within them, wet newborns with hooves that demand purchase from the earth, while their dense heads but swollen udders. Sometimes the ewe doesn't know what to do blue and butting her own head against the stall. Who would not want to let her out, to green into summer, wool into winter, then sheer, to be stolid even in the wayward shock of electric fence. I am a girl outside her bedroom door every day before school, checking the rise and fall of her chest, her eyes always closed to me. Now in my own home, never a cradle, never a crib, no one to watch from the door. So my dear mother lived to be 100, and in the process of her aging was not always graceful on her part or mine. So here's a very short poem, and I refer to this poem to a number of children's games like hopscotch, and the one where you like pull the petal off a daisy to say he loves you not, and also the superstition that I grew up with, that if you step on a crack, you break your mother's back. Do you all know that? So this is called The Sidewalk at Maple Grove. Not chalk, but cracks. Mother's ancient ruin of back, etched in pavement by winters and thaw. Do not step. Do not hop. Scotch. Sometimes you love her not. As Phil mentioned, I'm from New Hampshire, and on the East Coast, I don't know if you have them in California, we have these big mushrooms, like they get like these big white, they're called puffballs, and they eventually like dry up and then send their spores, disperse their spores. So I refer to those in this poem. In fall meadows, up from a mesh of white threads that reach for food into decay, the puffball blooms from downy mold. While hunters aim their guns at grouse, the fungus blouses to fleshy rounds that over time will dry, disperse a dust of living spores. My mother's ashes scattered here to feed the spreading threads next year. So last summer, we had to have our back patio completely demolished, jackhammered, because there were these like big cracks, big fissures that were opening up into it, and it was sort of threatening to fall down the hill. And at the same time, I went in for my routine mammogram, but of course it wasn't routine, and they found these suspicious things, and they kept sending me for this test and the other test, and everything is fine. But this poem is kind of a conversation between those two events happening at the same time. Clay and fruit. Men step, test for solid ground, flood our backyard with water to detect pockets of air where earth should be. Stone-pocked, dense breasts, white tissue shadowed by dark flecks, like night birds crossing the moon. O spackled skin of pit and divot, what hand will soothe, make you smooth? Through slate and concrete, past rebar, past dirt and stone, men jackhammer into earth's clay and ooze. Needle down deep, doctor, take what you need. Listen with your ultrasound, how the years depend, slack to ground. I hold my breath until the plates upheave, put my arm back in its sleeve. all these hands working, after the patio is made rubble, after the rubble is cleared, men come with shovels and the rhythm of afternoon heat, a steady chunk, chunk into mounds of sand. Out in the yard, I twist an overgrown lemon from our tree. It is warm, dusty, nearly weightless in my hand. So a few years back, I got really interested in Shackleton's explorations of Antarctica. And I read this book called Endurance, Shackleton's Incredible Voyage by Alfred Lansing. And so I started to write a poem, of course, about Shackleton. And it more or less turned into a kind of an exploration of the various kinds of cold and ice. And also kind of what about the women left behind when the men go out on these journeys. And I don't know if you know this story, but it's just a really amazing story of how Shackleton set off with like 25 men and broke through their ship. The Endurance broke through all this ice, and eventually, like, they were a day away from their goal, and the ship just got completely hemmed in, and so they had to just hang out. And they had to get off the ship because it was like sort of creaking and cracking, and eventually it sunk. So they were out in the middle of nowhere, and Shackleton took a few men and a lifeboat basically, and went around and found this little island where there were people on it, and came back a year later. They were all still there. They all survived. It's an amazing story. That was just a bonus. You don't really need to know that. They had supplies. So they had like cans of tinned things, but they also, when they could, seals, gulls, and there were dogs. They had dogs, sled dogs. So
no cannibalism,
no.
Pretty cool.
Yeah, it's amazing. So this poem is in three small parts, and it's called Cold. 1, black ice. When you come into cold, hold tight to your ribs. Look up at the houses that rise from sea smoke, where people carry on with happy lives. They will feel you, small and dark on their street, hear how you want what they have. Imagine yourself at the highest window, you looking out at yourself looking in. Learn to roll with the floorboards, salt water warped, shifting. Absorb the stories of the house until you own its leather-bound library and high-backed chairs, the warmth of its oil lamps. Every woman has her own language. Wear your alphabet on your ribs. 2, pack ice. In Shackleton's Antarctica, ice-locked sailors made serious study of marrow and the narrow needle, scrimshawed history on the bones of dead sled dogs, while their breath condensed into corkscrews of frozen beard. Bless this sailor's rope, the hole hacked in ice, the fish too cold to bite. Keep safe these wet tents and rotting socks, the canned beets and seal meat. At home, every day, the same maiden voyage. Sharp pointed needles with long eyes drawn by shadow wives into French knots and Florentine, cross stitches, dry kisses. Bad luck to be a woman wanting the glow of the captain's quarters. 3. Drift. The way he holds a drink in his hand, shakes ice against the glass, the way he knocks back a cube, caves it in his mouth, tames the jut of angles with heat, spits it back to the glass, whirls it around the bottom, the ice like a skater circling a solid pond. The skater, sealed in the centrifugal force of his wrist, hears nothing but wind. Routine hems them in, ice caught before they can alter course, frozen side by side in their chairs, pocket of air between them, golden weak spot, place they might break through for breath like otters in winter seas. They take the measure of drift, turn up the thermostat, the volume on TV, go to bed early, read by light of his and her lamps. They hunger for a fresh peach, warm pair of socks, that shared rib. And this is a little bit of a love song, small poem. The thing I know best. On my naked chest, in bed, your fingers set to tapping, little bee stings in the twilight. My rib cage rings its hollow tune. A Bordeaux on our tongues, a terrible fullness of river and lead. The thing I know best is sadness, a stone aging in a cask. I count on the way you tap out the pulse. So I just have 2 more poems, and one of the other kind of things I've been interested in besides Shackleton is World War I. But the odd thing is that it happened at the same time. I mean, Shackleton was exploring while the World War I was happening. So I've written a lot of poems about World War I, and this one it's about my grandfather, kind of, because I didn't know my grandfather, and the wonderful thing about being a poet is that we have poetic license to make things up. So I do know that he fought in World War I because it says so on his gravestone. So here's the poem. If my grandfather, who died before I was born, knowing nothing lets loose the facts, lets truth go walking. Knowing nothing is a bloom of yeast, a blur released to fiction. It is World War I. He is a soldier in a field hospital. Let him be observed, wintering under the pretty nurse's care, while the front shudders out from his nightmares. I will let him be lucky, this private, his limbs all there, his face still whole. But the dark horse, its panicked hoof, where else was it to tread in the twisted field of battle? The soldier bleeds from the belly, goes under, staring at the nurse's black hair. I was born, he whispers, in Canada. I will let them be married, settle outside of London. He will become a vicar. She will have several affairs. They will have no children. I will never be born. And my final poem, do we have people in the audience who watch MSNBC? Yeah. Yes. And so I do too. And if you're like me, you probably have like a love-hate relationship with Rachel Maddow. She both like fascinates me and frustrates me. So I wrote this poem because of that. Dear Rachel Maddow, why don't you ever wear a necklace? I ask because I like a little chain at the neck. I confess that often when I watch your show, I'm just reading the crawler at the bottom of the screen because it gives me the news faster than you do. And sometimes I'm just staring at the mole on your neck or the chunky ring on your middle finger of your right hand as you wave it about in explication. If we were friends, I would know the story behind that ring. I hope it's not from someone who died, or if it is, you're okay with that. In the off hours, we both like to wear eyeglasses instead of contacts, like when you appear on The Late Show with Stephen Colbert, and I sit at home and knit and watch. I also prefer to wear pants. Have I got that right? How many different people do your makeup? Sometimes you look a little too pale around the eyes. You talk much more than I do. I'm a fan of the simple sentence. Sometimes I talk to you through the screen, raise my voice a little. Well, actually, I yell to tell you to just get to the goddamn point. I know you can't hear me, but it's better than pouring myself another glass of wine. I miss your Friday night cocktail moment. I hate to drink alone, but I do. And sometimes I just fast forward. Thank you.